Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, a winter evening when the sky had turned the color of ash. The town square was crowded, but this was no fair, no celebration. It was a placement day, the grim marketplace where children who had lost everything were handed over to whoever would take them. 10-year-old Ruthie Callahan stood on the wooden platform. Her hair was pale gold, but her eyes held a stillness that only people who have lost too much carry. Ruthie hadn't been born deaf. 3 winters ago, a fever had stolen her hearing, and in the same terrible week, it had taken both her parents. Since then, she had lived inside a silence nobody around her seemed willing to understand. $1, the county agent, a sweating man named Higgins, shouted, wiping his brow with a stained handkerchief. "She's a hard worker, folks. Just doesn't hear. Someone take her home." Whispers moved through the crowd like a cold current. A woman near the front muttered, "What use is a deaf girl? She can't call for help, can't hear you calling her." One by one, people began turning their backs and walking away. It was easier than looking at a child nobody wanted. Ruthie stood perfectly straight, her small fists clenched at her sides, as if holding herself together by will alone. At the edge of the square stood a tall, quiet man, Nathaniel Cole, 40 years old, a rancher with old grief carved into his face. He had come to town for winter supplies, not for a child. His house, once filled with laughter, had stood silent for 3 years, ever since a fever had taken his wife Sarah, and within the same terrible month, his young daughter Mary. Nathaniel watched the crowd disperse, watched the shivering girl standing alone on the platform, and felt something sharp twist in his chest, not pity, but a quiet, rising anger at the ease with which people looked away. He stepped forward. "I'll take her," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the square. Higgins blinked in surprise, then broke into a relieved grin. $1, Mr. Cole, sold, and glad of it." Nathaniel reached into his coat, placed a single silver dollar on the ledger, and signed his name. Ruthie looked up at him for the first time. No gratitude in her expression, no fear either. Just a sharp, careful assessment, the kind that comes from a person who has learned to read danger in a stranger's face before trusting it. The wagon ride home took 3 hours across frozen, rutted roads. The wind cut through every layer of clothing. Nathaniel reached behind the bench and pulled out a heavy wool blanket, holding it toward her. Ruthie flinched hard, throwing up a defensive arm, shrinking away as though expecting to be struck. Nathaniel froze. That single motion told him more about where she'd been than any words could have. He didn't force the blanket on her. He simply laid it on the empty seat between them, within her reach, and returned his eyes to the road. 5 minutes passed, then a small, pale hand reached out and pulled the blanket over her lap. When they arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. The cabin stood sturdy but lifeless, its windows dark. Nathaniel lit the stove, and slowly warmth crept into the room. He led Ruthie to a small bedroom off the main room, a door that hadn't been opened in 3 years. It had been Mary's. He pointed to her, then to the room. "Yours." Ruthie stepped inside, looked around at the bare bed frame and small dresser, then looked back at him, searching his face for some hidden catch. Finding none, she walked in and quietly closed the door. Morning came with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Nathaniel came downstairs to find Ruthie already awake, standing on a wooden crate pulled up to the stove, stirring a pot of oats in his spare apron, wrapped twice around her small frame. She worked with a tense, frantic energy, the energy of someone trying to prove her worth before anyone could decide to send her back. When the stairs creaked and startled her, she dropped the spoon and stepped back, head bowed, waiting for a scolding. Instead, Nathaniel picked up the spoon, tapped it against the pot's rim, and handed it back to her. He pointed to the oats, rubbed his stomach, and gave a firm, approving nod. Something in her shoulders loosened just slightly.
The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Nathaniel taught her to feed the chickens, to carry water, to help with small chores around the barn. One morning he found her sitting alone on an overturned bucket, holding something small and metal, rubbing her thumb over it, crying without a single sound. Her shoulders shook, but no noise escaped her. He approached slowly, deliberately scuffing his boots against the frozen ground so the vibration would warn her before he got close. She startled anyway, quickly wiping her face and shoving the object into her pocket. But her cold fingers fumbled, and it slipped, falling into the dirt. Nathaniel knelt and picked it up. It was a dented silver locket on a worn ribbon. Inside was a tintype photograph of a man in uniform, and beneath it a small folded piece of parchment, brittle with age. He unfolded it carefully. It read, "Sergeant William Callahan, 4th Wyoming Infantry, commended for exceptional bravery at the Battle of Rattlesnake Creek." Nathaniel stared at the paper, then at the small, shivering girl in front of him. This was the granddaughter of a soldier who had given everything for his men, sold for $1 on a wooden platform. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it back inside the locket, and handed it to her. He didn't offer pity. He understood already that pity would insult her. Instead, he looked her directly in the eye, pointed to the locket, then to her, and gave a slow, respectful salute. Ruthie's eyes widened. She understood completely. The tears stopped. She took the locket back, and her chin lifted, just a fraction, with something like pride. Weeks later, they needed to return to town before the mountain passes froze solid. The general store was warm, smelling of peppermint and wool. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Pratchett, a sharp-tongued woman who knew everyone's business. "Nathaniel Cole," she said, eyeing Ruthie behind his leg. "I heard the rumors were true. You took the deaf girl." Nathaniel ignored the bait. "She needs a winter coat, heavy wool, and boots." Mrs. Pratchett approached Ruthie the way one might approach a stray dog, speaking loudly as if volume alone could cure deafness. "She doesn't talk, does she? Just stares? It's unnatural. A child should be bright and helpful. How's she supposed to hear a rattlesnake? You wasted your $1, Nathaniel." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "She works harder than most grown men I know. Just get the boots." While they waited, a heavy-set ranch hand named Dobbs walked in and dropped a sack of flour hard onto the counter, deliberately close to Ruthie, clearly hoping to startle her. She didn't flinch. She simply turned, looked at the sack, then looked up at him with flat, unimpressed calm. Dobbs scowled. "Strange little thing." Nathaniel stepped between them, his voice low and even, the kind of calm that was more unsettling than shouting. "You've got business here. Do it, then step away from my ward." Dobbs raised his hands and backed off. Mrs. Pratchett returned with the coat and boots. When Ruthie put them on, warmth spread visibly across her face, the first time that Nathaniel had met her that she looked truly warm. Outside, he looked down at her and tapped his chest, then pointed to her. "We know you," he said, knowing she couldn't hear the words, but needing to say them anyway. Ruthie reached out and briefly gripped the sleeve of his coat. It was fleeting, but it was the first time she had touched him on purpose. 3 weeks later, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The temperature dropped fast, and the wind began to howl down from the mountains, a genuine prairie blizzard, the kind that could kill cattle standing in open ground. "The pregnant heifers," Nathaniel said, grabbing his coat. "They're in the lower pasture." He turned to Ruthie, pointed at her, then firmly at the floor. "Stay." He pointed to the stove. "Keep the fire going." Ruthie shook her head, grabbed her new coat from the peg, and pulled it on. Nathaniel gripped her shoulders and shook his head sharply. "No, too dangerous." Ruthie pulled out the locket, tapped the metal face, then tapped her own chest. "I am a Callahan. I'm coming." There was no time to argue. Nathaniel tied a rope around his waist and looped the other end around hers, and they stepped out into the storm together. The wind hit like a physical blow, stripping away sight and sound alike. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Cole, found himself deaf too, swallowed by the roaring white. They waded through drifts to find the heifers huddled against a stand of frozen trees. One bolted through a break in the fence, and Nathaniel, chasing it, caught his boot on a hidden root and went down hard. His knee twisted with a sickening pop. Pain shot up his leg like fire. He tried to rise and collapsed instead. He was 300 yards from the house, unable to walk, the cold already numbing his hands. He felt a sharp tug on the rope. Out of the whiteout, Ruthie appeared, her lashes crusted with ice, her face red and raw. She knelt beside him, saw the unnatural angle of his leg, and didn't panic. She fumbled to untie the rope from her own waist, trying to send herself alone toward the house, but Ruthie grabbed his hands and stopped him. She looked him in the eye, calm and unafraid. Then she stood, turned her back to the wind, closed her eyes, and went completely still. Nathaniel didn't understand until he did. In a world where he was blind with snow and deaf from wind, Ruthie lived in silence every day. She didn't need her ears to read the world. She read it through the earth itself. She felt the particular vibration of wind striking the barn wall. She felt the subtle shift of the draft coming off the distant creek. She opened her eyes, pointed into the white, grabbed his collar, and pulled. For 4 years, Nathaniel had believed he needed no one, that his own strength was enough, that solitude was safety. He had thought, in taking her in, that he was rescuing a helpless child. He had been entirely wrong. He was the helpless one now. His leg was useless, his coat frozen stiff, dragging him down like an anchor. Ruthie became the strength he no longer had. She gripped his collar with both raw hands, dug her boots into the snow, and pulled, step, brace, pull, again and again, with a rhythm that never broke. His mind began to drift as the cold deepened. He thought of Sarah, of Mary, of how he had done everything right when the fever came, chopped the wood, drawn the water, held the cool cloths to their foreheads, and it had meant nothing. His strength hadn't saved them then. Now, dragged through the freezing dark by an 11-year-old girl, he understood, finally, why he had truly signed that ledger. He hadn't taken her in to save her. He had done it to prove to himself he could still keep someone alive. It was a desperate, selfish hope, and now the truth of it lay bare in the ice. He was not her protector. He was her burden. But Ruthie didn't let go. She navigated by memory, by the shape of the ground beneath her boots, by the difference between open snow and packed earth near the yard. Suddenly the wind broke. They were inside the barn. Ruthie dropped his collar and collapsed to her knees, gasping. Nathaniel lay on his back, and when he looked at her, small, shivering, coated in snow, she looked in that moment larger than anyone he had ever known. She didn't rest. She grabbed a canvas tarp and threw it over him, unhitched the draft horse Samson, and brought him close so his body heat could warm the air. Then she looked at Nathaniel's swollen knee, the fabric stretched tight over the unnatural bulge. She found a knife and 2 flat boards on the workbench, along with a spool of twine, and knelt beside him. She pointed to his leg, then to the knife. He nodded. She cut through the frozen wool and began splinting the leg as best she could, pulling the twine tight. He groaned but didn't cry out. He wouldn't frighten her. When it was done, she sat back, pulled off her frozen mittens, and pressed her bare palms to his cheeks, checking for fever. Nathaniel reached up with a trembling hand, covered hers with his own, tapped his chest, pointed to her, and nodded deeply. "Thank you." She understood and nodded back. They stayed in the barn through the night, Ruthie curled against Samson's warm flank, waking every hour to check his breathing. By morning, the storm had broken, but Nathaniel was burning with fever, his lips cracked, slipping in and out of awareness. Ruthie knew the splint wasn't enough. He needed a doctor. She dug through drifted snow for an hour to clear the barn doors, led Samson out bareback with only a dragged crate to climb from, and rode into the blinding white toward town. In Cedar Hollow, Dr. Whitmore was drinking his morning coffee when the clinic door burst open. Ruthie stumbled in, covered in frost, her eyes wild. She grabbed his sleeve, pulling him toward the door before he could even ask what was wrong. When he resisted, confused, she mimed falling, clutched her knee, twisted her face in pain, and pointed outside again more urgently. He understood immediately, grabbed his bag, and called for help.
They brought Nathaniel back on a borrowed sled. The doctor worked for 2 hours, setting the bone, stitching torn skin, pouring broth down his throat, packing his chest with warm poultices against the fever settling in his lungs. Ruthie stood in the corner the entire time, refusing to sit, refusing to leave. Finally, the doctor straightened, wiping his hands. "He'll live," he said. "Stubborn as an old mule, but he'll live." He knelt to Ruthie's eye level and offered a gentle thumbs up. "You did good." Ruthie reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket. She wanted him to understand she wasn't just a stray the rancher had taken pity on. She was someone. She opened it and held it out. The doctor's face went pale as he read the folded commendation. "Sergeant William Callahan," he whispered, and sat back heavily. "Your grandfather?" He pointed to her, then the photograph, and rocked his arms like cradling a baby. Ruthie nodded. The doctor closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his weathered face. "Rattlesnake Creek," he whispered. "July. We were cut off, surrounded. Dead men, all of us. Your grandfather held 20 men at the creek line so the wagons could get through. It cost him his life. It saved 80 of ours." He touched the locket gently. "It saved mine." He walked to the clinic door and opened it to the small crowd waiting outside for news. "Nathaniel Cole will live," he announced, his voice carrying real weight now. "He'll live because this girl pulled him out of a blizzard alone, kept him warm through the night, and splinted his leg herself. Her name is Ruthie Callahan. Her grandfather died holding the line at Rattlesnake Creek so man in this very county could come home and build this town. And every one of us stood in that square and let her be sold for $1. A heavy silence fell, not the ugly silence of the auction block, but one of genuine shame and respect. Mrs. Pratchett looked down at her boots. Dobbs removed his hat and lowered his head. Spring came to Cedar Hollow with fierce, sudden green. Nathaniel walked with a cane now, his leg permanently stiffened, but his back stood straight. Curtains hung in the cabin windows. A vegetable garden grew near the barn. He sat whittling on the porch, watching Ruthie, 14 now, taller, sure-footed, carry a bucket of feed to the chickens, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. In town, there were no more whispers when they came for supplies, only nods, waves, small kindnesses. Mrs. Pratchett always kept a piece of peppermint candy on the counter for her. Dobbs had spent a week rebuilding their corral fence and refused to take a single coin for it. Ruthie finished with the chickens and came to sit beside Nathaniel on the porch, bumping her shoulder against his, easy and familiar. He handed her a small carved figure he'd been working on, a little wooden horse, Samson. She turned it over in her hands, then looked up and made the sign they had built together over that long winter, pointing to the horse, to him, then bringing both hands to rest over her heart. Family. Nathaniel felt something settle in his chest that had been missing for years, not the ache of grief, but the quiet weight of peace. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close and set it back to the wind, to the prairie, to no one but himself. Family.
He had gone to town on a winter morning for flour and salt pork. He had paid $1 for a deaf child because the silence of an entire crowd had made him angry. He hadn't known how to raise her. He hadn't known if he even wanted to try. But sitting there on the porch, watching the light fade gold over the hills, Nathaniel understood the truth at last. He hadn't saved her. She had saved him. And it remained without question the finest dollar a man had ever spent. This story carries a simple but powerful truth. A person's worth is never measured by their voice or their hearing, but the courage and heart they carry inside. Judgment comes easy, but empathy asks more of us, and often the one we call weak turns out to be the strongest when the storm finally arrives.